make eye contact. They'll never speak to you. They'll always walk past and they just look the other way. And he said, unless you try to call out or you try to grab their attention or you make a noise, he said, you're invisible. You aren't seen anymore. And he says one day he's at a bus shelter. He slept in the bus shelter overnight. And in the morning, he's sitting with all his belongings and he's sitting in the bus shelter and he's thinking, where do I go today to try and eke out a bit of food? And he said a mom and a daughter arrive and they're going to catch the bus and they come and sit down. And he said he feels really awkward. And he said the awkward thing is, do you immediately grab all your belongings and run? Because he said that almost is like even more weird. But do you stay and they feel awkward? But he said this mom is different. And this mom turns around and looks at him and says, did you sleep here last night? And he says, yes, I did. And she starts to chat and ask him about his life and what led to him being here. And the mom says, in this whole time, this little daughter's just staring at him, tiny little one. And the little daughter's listening to the whole conversation. And at the end of the conversation, the little one goes over to mom and says, can I hug that man? And the mom's totally shocked and she says, of course you can. And she goes over and she grabs that man and she holds on to him for a couple of seconds. And he said it felt like hours. He said it was the first physical contact he had had since leaving home. And he said, as she held him, he said something broke inside of him and he started to cry. And at that moment, the bus pulled up and the mom said, I'm so sorry, we have to leave you. And he said, they got on the bus and drove off. And he said, at that moment, something happened in his life and he turned his life around. And he tells the story of being able to come back and to the point where he was able to get a job and then get some state housing and get his life back on track again. I couldn't help but think of him as I read the story. I thought, this is the story of the beggar. This is the story of Lazarus. You see, this upside-down kingdom and what we've read in the story this morning and what we're going to go through in a little more depth now is that God says, no, hold on a moment. The way that it works is that you have very successful people, rich people at the top. And then it filters down and the masses sit at the bottom. And if you look at the figures about the wealth of the world, is that top 3% earn as much as the lowest 20%, I think it is, across the face of the globe. Just absolutely incredible. God says, no, hold on a moment. That's how the world works. I want to tell you that my kingdom is the other way around. My kingdom's the other way around. I don't care much for your wealth. I don't care much for your fame. I don't care much for your religiosity. I care for the beggar. I care for the one who doesn't have. I care for the one in the bus shelter. I'm going to go and hug the one in the bus shelter. And so I want to this morning take us through this. And the part that I didn't like is that as I read this and as I studied it and prepared for this, I thought, I'm not sure that I'm ready to go this deep. Can I just be honest? For some of you, you're already there. You're saying, come on, Mark, you can come with us. We've been deep. But I'm not sure that I'm ready to go this deep. This is pretty deep. Let's go through it. Luke chapter 16. Let's start again at verse 13. We've gone through that, and we've spoken about that he's speaking to the Pharisees. Jump down to verse 19. There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen. This is the equivalent of Gucci of the day. This is the equivalent of the Louis Vuitton suit. This is the man. This is the suit, sorry, sir, you can't afford. And ma'am, you couldn't afford if it was the equivalent in a dress. This is fancy pants stuff, and he lived in luxury every day. At his gate was laid a beggar named Lazarus, covered with sores. I had to laugh when he used the word Lazarus. I thought he's thinking of his mate that he raised from the dead, but he's just using it in a story. It's not the same Lazarus, by the way. And longing to eat what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs came and licked his sores. And the time came when the beggar died, and the angels carried him to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. The parable is about two characters. They're real opposites. The one is rich and the other's poor. The one has garments, the other has sores. The one is feasting, the other one's starving. The one has a burial, and the other one, we're not told. We guess that he died on the street. We must assume. But this rich and poor, you see, God's not busy, I don't believe. He's busy saying, listen, all rich people are going to hell and all poor people are going to heaven. That's certainly not the image that he's trying to do. Because then the poor man, Lazarus, goes to spend time with Abraham, and Abraham was one of the richest men in the Bible. But let me say this. One has the name and the other has not. It's the only story. Now you say, Mark, you're making a whole heap about this, but give me a little bit of license to take you through this. Okay. Jesus tells heaps of parables through his time on earth. And in no parable does he use a name. Have you ever noticed that? He uses the sower. He uses the poor. He uses all sorts. There's only one parable where he uses somebody's name. It's this one. He says, this story is about Lazarus. He's got a name. You know what the rich man's name is? We don't know. It was very interesting. As I started to research this, there was stuff that was like real old. 1600s that I was reading. This is from dead guys, okay, that had written this stuff. And it was the story about Dives and Lazarus. And I was like, what? Where did they get the name Dives from? And I was like, I've never seen this. Like, where's Dives? Anyway, but Dives apparently is the Latin word for the rich man. And so this is called the story of Dives. His name was not Dives. He did not have a name. But Lazarus had a name. And you know what I see in the story is God's busy saying, this is a man who has a name. He's got an identity. We know who he is. This is not just a nobody, it's a somebody. It's a man with a name that has an identity, and it's based on something. The rich man, he's got no identity. And the reason he's got no identity is because his identity is wound up in what he has in the bank account. It's not wound up in who he is. And the part that challenged me in the story is my identity wound up in what I have and who I am and the job I hold and the places I've been to and the stories I can tell? Or is my identity wound up in who I am in God? Verse 23. In Hades. Now, we would need to unpack that whole thing about Hades. Can I use a bit of poetic license here for the theologians? I'm going to use hell because here he's talking about flames and fire. Okay, so we're going to go hell. In hell, where he was in torment, he looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. So he called to him, Father Abraham, have pity on me and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue because I'm in agony in this fire. Now, the one who would bring water to the rich man, guess what he was? A slave. He used a slave to bring it. This man is in hell and he's saying, hey, Father Abraham, send that slave there with you. Send him over here. Tell him to bring water. I'm like, you're in hell, mate. First of all. And secondly is that even though you're in hell, you're calling across the chasm and you're starting to demand. You still haven't realized is that he has his identity right and you don't. You see, the challenge that we have is that we look at this whole thing and we think, this fire story, Hell. I mean, I use the hell word. Can you believe it? I'm not sure if I'm allowed to use the hell word in Australia, but I'm going to use it. Okay, hell. Listen, it's a horrible place. It's absolutely horrible. It's not politically correct to talk about anymore. If you listen to preachers and churches, you will not hear hell. They will not talk about hell anymore. They're very politically incorrect. I loved one of the commentators. He said, you know what? He said, I've been in the ministry for 45 years. And he said, often people will, after I've spoken about hell, they'll come and they'll say, you know that whole flames thing? I mean, you don't really believe that, do you? And he'll go, oh, no, I don't. And they'll go, phew, thank goodness. You say, I believe it's symbolic, and I believe it's far worse than flames. Far worse. And he says their eyes almost pop out of their head. But I don't believe it's flames either. Now you say, well, it says flames. I believe flames. You go for it, whatever. If it was flames, you would have third-degree burns, and then eventually you're just going to die. No. I believe that these flames are symbolic of something way worse. This is hell. C.S. Lewis. Come on. Can we get that quote up here? This is horrendous stuff. This is what C.S. Lewis says about hell. And I kind of agree with him. This is what he says. In the long run, the answer to those who object to the doctrine of hell is itself a question. What are you asking God to do? To wipe out their past sins and at all costs to give them a fresh start, smoothing every difficulty and offering every miraculous help. But he has done so on Calvary. Are you asking God to forgive them? They will not be forgiven. To leave them alone? Alas, I am afraid that is what he does. And what C.S. Lewis is saying is, listen, hell is when you're left to your own devices. Ooh, can I say that again? Hell is when we're left to our own devices. And Tim Keller says this, he said, hell is the greatest monument of our own self-will. In other words, what C.S. Lewis is saying is, do you see the fights that broke out in Northbridge and Scarborough? That is hell, is when it starts to play out. And when we spoke about the kingdom coming, we see the darkness coming and rolling in. There's a war that's busy happening between light and darkness, the kingdom of light and the kingdom of darkness. And we get little tastes of the kingdom of heaven as we see miracles happening. And as we see people being set free and we see hope coming, we see little glimpses of hell when we start to see the absolute atrocities that happen in the world. Where mothers kill their kids, when fathers kill their families, when all the horrendous things happen that happen in our very own city, may I add, old people being beaten to within an inch of their lives and sometimes killed. And sorry to be so brutal, but I want to say, let's not mess with this thing. There is a heaven and a hell that awaits. And for us, we need to understand that the rolling in of the kingdom of God and the rolling in of darkness is very different. The big difference, one of them is where we're submitting and saying, God, for your glory alone, your will be done. And the other, where it says, my will be done, I'm going to live my own way. Verse 25, but Abraham replied, son, remember that in your lifetime, you received your good things. When I read that, you received your good things, I was led back to the prodigal son. Remember that story? You received your good things. While Lazarus, verse 25, Lazarus received bad things, but now he is comforted here and you are in agony. And besides all this, between us and you, a great chasm has been set in place, so that those who want to go from here to you cannot, nor can anyone come across from there to us. The view that people have in the modern and especially in the first world, I think, is one of God standing and throwing people into hell. And as they desperately try to claw up the sides to get out, he shuts the lid and laughs. Ha, 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 ha. I've got you. That is the very, very last thing that we find with God. In fact, it's the very opposite. Some of you may have seen the video clip of John Maxwell where he tells the story and he goes to see this businessman, and this businessman says to him, "How could I believe in your God? How could I believe in your God, the God that sends people to hell?" And he says, "Oh, no, that's not my God. That's not my God." And the guy says, "What do you mean?" And he says, "No, you've got the wrong God." He says, "Not my God." He says, "I don't know which God that is. It's not my God." He says, "What do you mean?" He says, "My God did everything in his power to stop you from going to hell." He said, he literally, he went to the cross. He rose from the dead. He took a whipping. They pulled out his beard. It was absolutely horrendous. He did everything you could imagine to keep you from hell. In fact, if you are wanting to go to hell, he said, you have to step over his dead body. I loved it. I thought that's so true. The picture is not of God. God has done everything he knows how is to divert us from hell. He's done everything he knows how to stop us from going there. This is an upside down kingdom. But in terms of that identity, one of the most helpful things, and this is the part that I want you to listen to. If you take nothing away from today, could I ask you just to listen for 3 minutes and let me unpack this? One of the commentaries that I read starts to make this statement. He said, if we're wanting to know where our identity is vested in, and it's speaking about the rich man and Lazarus, if we're wanting to know where our identity is vested in, we need to look at what we hate. Now, are you with me? You're listening. If we're wanting to know what our identity is vested in, listen or look at what you hate. And so he said, if you hate lazy people, he said your identity is vested in the fact that you are such a hard worker. He said, if your identity is, if you hate the poor, your identity is vested in your wealth. If you hate the opposite political party, your identity is vested in your own political party. If you hate immoral people, your identity is vested in your own morality. If you hate other race groups, your identity is formed by your own race group. And if you hate other religions, your own religion has become your identity and not Christ. And as I read that, I started to realize, you know what? There are a whole heap of things. I'm not going to tell you because you're all going to go, oh, we knew it. I'm not going to tell you what I hate, but there are things that I do hate. And I realized, I hate that thing because that thing has formed my identity. And I hate that thing and that's formed my identity. And I want to encourage is that we're going to go back to the Bible and say, oh God, help me, is to unpack what it is that I hate so that I can understand my own identity. And in understanding my own identity, I can be formed and fashioned to be more like you. Let's go to verse 27. He answered, then I beg you, Father, send Lazarus to my family, for I have 5 brothers. Let him warn them so that they will not also come to this place of torment. And Abraham replied, they have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them. In other words, what he's saying is, Father Abraham, can you send them over there? Give them some good knowledge. You know, if they had knowledge, if they knew, then they wouldn't do that. And then they wouldn't do it. And Father Abraham says, it doesn't work like that. They already have the knowledge. The knowledge is available. It's already out there. Knowledge is not going to do it. He said, listen, those brothers of mine, they're as horrendous as I am. They're just as bad as I am. Let them have a really good experience with somebody coming from the dead. I mean, like literally, you know, surely if we had Moses or Isaiah walking in this morning, we would all be like, oh my goodness, Moses rocked up to our meeting. He says, no. He says, no. Even if I send someone who is raised from the dead, they wouldn't do it. And I'm amazed that in the day and age that we live in, even though somebody has been raised from the dead, people will still not believe. Will still not believe. And it becomes our very identity. Now, let's jump down to two things. The first one is, if this identity issue is so big, then how do we get it and how do we not get it? And let me start by saying this is how we don't get it. This is how we don't change our identity. You see, he wants his big brothers to have an emotional experience. He wants them to have knowledge. It's not going to change. That's what the story is about. You're not going to change your identity through that. But here is how you're going to do it. If we're going to take Moses and the prophets, what we call the Bible, seriously, we need to understand why he died and why he rose again. Now, let me tell a story, and then I'm going to go back to that point. Martin Lloyd-Jones tells this story. He said, one day you arrive home, and there's a friend of yours that's busy waiting for you at your home. And as you walk up, you go, it's really good to see you. What are you doing here? And he said, I just came to tell you I paid your debt. And he said, how would you respond? How would you respond if your friend told you that? He said, you would respond by saying, what debt did you pay? He said, because if he paid for the parcel that he's holding in his hand, because the postage wasn't paid, and he paid the postage for it, he said, you would go, thank you very much. High five. Really appreciate what you did. But if he says, listen, I found out that the ATO have been investigating you, and you had $3 million back taxes that hadn't been paid, and there was a massive mistake in it, he said, how would you respond then? He said, you'd probably get down on your knees and kiss the guy's toes. He said, it makes a difference when you know what the debt is. He said, you have to ask, what is the debt? What is this that you paid for me? And he said, in exactly the same way, he said, we're shaped and fashioned and formed by saying, Jesus, what debt did you pay? I need to understand the debt that you paid. Jamie Smith, who's a well-known writer, and I'd encourage you to read some of his stuff, says that love has to change our identity. We become what we love, he writes. Transformed by the overwhelming sense of love. In other words, is if we love motor cars, that thing will sit on the throne of our hearts. Whatever it is that we love is going to take that place in our hearts. And he said that thing's going to fashion and form your identity. And for our identity to change, we are going to have to move to this place of saying, oh God, your will and your will be done alone. I'll tell you, friends, the part that I've struggled with is I don't want to get into saying, well, all of you, if you're wealthy, and that's everyone in this church, by the way, if you're wealthy, you're going to hell. We've all got to become poor like Lazarus so that we can make it to heaven. That's not the point that Jesus was trying to make. The point that he was trying to make is what fashions your identity? What fashions your identity? Are we prepared to give up everything so that we can have his identity? And that's the deep part that I struggled with. Am I prepared to give up everything so that I can be fashioned by his identity? As we start to wrap up, we arrived in Australia 17 years ago. And I was so pleased that God had sent me to this country. I really couldn't imagine that God was giving this country such a gift in me arriving. And I joke, but I did arrive with a bit of an attitude. In fact, it wasn't a bit, it was just one massive truckload of attitude. And my attitude was, I'm incredibly connected in the church. I know how church works. We've been in churches. I've been in the ministry. I know how things work. I know how to run churches. I can help you. I also had walked a journey that I thought, if I bring this journey to Australia, this is going to help. This is going to set people free. Before we had left in Cape Town, we ran a consultancy that was really, really successful. And I brought that as a job. And so, not only was I going to be a blessing to the church, but I was going to be this incredible blessing to the business world as well. And be able to add my weight and pay my way and be a real gift. That old truckload. And but there was a little bit of a mistake that I made. Little bit of a mistake. And that was, oh God, your will be done, not mine. And if I knew then what I know now, I'm not sure I would have prayed it. Because it was at that time that God took out his bazooka, his spiritual bazooka, and said, if it's going to be my will and not your will, I'm going to have to blow up the truck and all 10 of the carriages that you are busy dragging in with you, because that stuff is not going to be helpful to this nation. And we landed, and we went and became part of a church, and they said, we've got a special place. We're so glad you came. We've got a special place for you. You see that pew right at the back? That's where you sit. Oh, you want to say something? No, you're not going to say anything. You're not going to say anything. Then the day came. They said, we want to start running home groups. And can we use your house? So I was like, praise God. Eventually, I get to add a little bit of value here. So they said, called us aside, said, okay, this is how it's going to work. People are all going to rock up at your house. You are not the leaders, and you're not allowed to say anything. Literally. That's how it worked. So everybody rocked up at our house. They all sat in our lounge for an hour and stared at us. It's like, and we just sat and looked at them. And then after an hour, they all said, okay, we're going to go now. And we went, okay. So they left. And then miraculously, they came back the next week. And they all sat for an hour, all looking at each other. And then they went home again. That was our incredible contribution. We were rocking it, I'm telling you. And I started applying for jobs. Got turned down one job after the other, after the other, after the other. And I was saying, God, what are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? Oh God, what are you doing? God said, this little thing we have to sort out. We have to sort this identity thing out. Because your identity is in the ministry you've been in and the churches you've served in. Your identity is in the job that you had and the success you've achieved. Your measure of success is measured in stuff that is not in the kingdom. Because Lazarus, he's successful. You know the guy who had his sores licked by dogs? Whoa, I think he's the man. He's successful. And I was like, God, it can't be. It can't be. I have so much to contribute, God. No, you have nothing. Nothing, nothing, nothing to contribute. Lazarus has got all of it to contribute because this is an upside down kingdom. You wanting to bring the kingdom of the world in. You wanting to bring some of the kingdom of darkness in. That is based on your success of the world and the hierarchy and the hierarchical thinking. No. I'm not having that. I want to fashion and form your identity. And sometimes it takes that the dogs are going to lick the sores. You know what? 17 years later, I read the story and I shudder. And I just say, oh God, I'm scared to pray. I'm scared to pray. But this I know. I would rather pray that prayer and be successful in the kingdom than have to be the rich man who had his own success, and according to C.S. Lewis, lives out and becomes a monument to himself. I started by saying, I trust that today we're going to be shaped. Our identity is going to be transformed. And there's going to be something that starts. And for me, it started with going through, what is it that I hate? Let me list those things, because the opposite of that started to tell me what it is that I love that actually formed my identity. Let me pray for us. Worship team, come with me. Lord, as heavy as this word could be, I want to pray that it becomes light. I want to pray that it becomes free, that it becomes easy, and for us to be able to rise up with something in us that says, oh God, I want to be fashioned and formed. I want to have your identity. I want to have your success. I want to have an upside down kingdom view of the world that I live in. Lord, where we have a hierarchical thinking, or a thinking that is based out of a previous life or a darkness that we've come out of, I pray today it break in the name of Jesus. And I pray a freedom comes in your wonderful name. Let's stand together. I'm going to sing, and then I'm going to come back. I want to pray one more prayer.